about yourself, your responsibilities, and which organization you are working?
Sure. So my name is Adnan Rehmat, and I have a journalism and media development background. And I work mostly on media professionalization issues, such as, promotion of public interest journalism and greater public interest narratives in the media, um, and also diversity and pluralism in media. Currently, I'm working as program manager for the International Media Support, which is a Denmark-based international NGO that works to promote public interest journalism across the world, particularly in countries that are facing conflicts or transition, where it's usually difficult to practice public interest journalism.
Right.
And I've been in this business for now over 30 years. Yeah.
Right. So definitely you have seen a lot of developments in Pakistani media landscape. Again, it's into a transition because of new technologies that are emerging. For example, AI technologies such as natural language processing technology, automated news writing, content production, etc., and distribution as well. I mean, like if we focus on the digital emerging digital organization in Pakistan, so you would definitely know about how they are targeting their audiences through understanding the analytics online. So how do you see overall this situation? How Pakistani digital newsrooms are going to welcome the AI technologies?
Sure. So I think there are at least two primary, let's say, caveats that we should consider before an answer can be contextualized and understood better.
Yeah.
So the first one is that media practice in Pakistan is primarily done by the corporate sector, while the state is still, even after over 20 years of privatization of the airwaves, the state is still is the third largest media owner in the country. So we have this sort of a hybrid context where there are different set of rules by which the public sector media operates, and the private sector. And often, they are in conflict when in terms of setting news agendas and also the kinds of narratives they're allowed or they prefer to run. And usually, considering Pakistan's political background, the state is often intolerant of pluralism and diversity in views and so on. And I think recent acceleration in introduction of technologies as a means of operating or managing media systems is a kind of a game changer, or certainly a factor that is impacting media like never before in Pakistan's context. And so if we look at the state sector, then we find that the state isn't too bothered in terms of understanding the impact of AI or planning on how to use it, which might not be a bad thing for now, because the state its instincts are to use it often in terms of either obfuscating the media agendas or to push certain kinds of agendas, which often are not in public interest. And the private sector, again, so there is the conventional corporate sector that runs the media, these big media houses like Dawn Group and Jung Group and some of the larger media houses. So there are two types of businesses: those that have been conducting, those that are, I call, media only businesses, and others that are mostly corporate interests, but in recent years, of the past 10 years or so, have also jumped into the media business. So I call these media also businesses. So media only business, media also businesses. And so there's a clear distinction in how they approach the media side. So the media only businesses like Dawn Group and Jung Group, etc., are really well placed in planning for and also in various ways implementing AI, because they've got large audiences that they just cannot lose. And so there's, comparatively speaking, greater degree of professionalism. And so they are using AI in various ways and to various degrees in embellishing their media business and in ensuring that, um, as far as is possible, how can they improve their outreach to audiences and so on. So that's sort of the first large, let's say, indicator by which we have to look at the Pakistani media. The second, of course, is opportunity. AI offers both primarily an opportunity for Pakistani media that faces so many other regulatory, policy, and market problems. And AI comes as an opportunity to paper over or to tide over some of these other problems and challenges they've been facing, such as eroding trust within the public and so on. And so AI potentially offers an opportunity where they can find, professional ways of improving their outreach, reaching out to new audiences, examining, data that can improve all these processes. So that's sort of the overall context. Now, the other question that you really asked was, what is the Pakistani media sector? Where does it stand in terms of all these changes and so on? That requires, a detailed look into specific and general practices. We see some of the better groups like Dawn, let's say, or Jung, that are ahead of the curve, way ahead of the curve compared to these other big corporate houses with influential but not necessarily professional media, the ARYs of this world and the Sama and some of the others that have cross media ownership. So it's not just limited to television, but also newspaper, and newspaper audiences themselves have migrated online. And so we see that, they're increasingly and to some degree effectively using technology and to, number one, ensure that media still stays relevant, particularly when audiences have changed. And secondly, in trying to understand what kind of news or information or infotainment that people want, and so they can accordingly, offer their information menus.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, because like in the industry, when we are working, and definitely journalism is a profession, it's not just work, it's a profession, and definitely it is governed by some ethics. So there is a set of ethics that is governing this profession, and we are well aware of current state of journalism ethics, that how journalists at individual level they are following, and how their ethics and the storytelling is impacting the societies. So after the AI, when it will be into their practice, so how do you see their understanding with regards to the ethical considerations? For example, if I say, if they have proper understanding with regards to algorithmic biases that can also impact the society, so are they prepared for that? Or if I also talk about in terms of a set of civil and political rights that are core when we practice journalism profession. So, for example, freedom of expression, right to information, and definitely when we are practicing journalism in online spaces, so privacy also becomes a very strong factor that we also have to look from the perspective of source and also from the perspective of of the public and people who we are actually covering. So how do you see all these ethical norms that a journalist should follow, but like when they will have this powerful tool of AI, so how it's going to impact the overall scenario?
Right. So I think the fundamental question here is how ethical is Pakistani media, and does the increasing use of AI and algorithm offer an opportunity to improve whatever level of ethical journalism is practiced. So I think to answer that, it's important to understand that media and journalists are two different entities. So media is an industry; it's owned by corporate entities, and journalists um, are workers, are basically essentially labor employed by that industry. And so Pakistan is not really exactly known for a professional bent or a professional the preference for professional journalism by media corporate entities. And that's because Pakistan's corporate media has political interests and also other political compulsions to ensure that they don't get targeted by the state or other actors, and so they have to enter into compromises with various actors. So having said that, they are still media entities and have to do, if we are considering the news media subsector of the overall media, then yes, the workers that work for them are journalists. And so then we'll have to take a look at whether there are codes of ethics in place, and how much of them are followed, and what is the compulsion, what is mandatory and what is voluntary. So we see that industry representative associations like All Pakistan Newspaper Society, which regulates the private press or print media, the Pakistan Broadcasters Association, the television broadcast industry, both radio and TV in the private sector. Both of them have their own respective codes of ethics, as do the journalists. So all Pakistan newspapers, the Pakistan Federal Union of Journalists have their own code. And also we have the Council of Pakistan Newspaper Editors, which is an editors guild. And so, but we see that um, other than the television, the PBA code of ethics, the previous codes were authored decades ago and haven't really been updated in terms of incorporating new realities. Of course, journalism principles will always remain the same:
Yeah.
Public interest and emphasis on public interest, truth and verification, and all of that. But I think in industrial terms, the media owners or the media industry doesn't emphasize ethical journalism. The state doesn't want media to be ethical, and so I think it's unfair to expect that journalists, whether on an individual level or when they're part of their professional associations, like in a journalists union or a press club, for them to practice ethics when the media owners don't mandate it. And so clearly compromises are made. And so in that sense, AI and the opportunity that it represents is still not, that opportunity is not being translated into an opening whereby the rules of the media game and the news media game will be negotiated anew or adopted anew. But having said that, I think we need to understand that the big media so the big media houses, their TV channels and their newspapers and others are embracing AI in terms of two in two ways. And I think that might have an effect on the quality of journalism as well. So the first is um, how AI processes are improving the workflows or making them more efficient, which means um, some processes, so research work, and then reaching out to new audiences. All of this can be done by using new technology, so that new sources can add some depth. And while some types of journalism in Pakistan is not allowed, particularly when it examines the states and its policies, there are other ways technology can help you in still doing the story without attracting crackdown. And the second one is, of course, media is digitalizing, everything is online, television and newspapers and so on. So you have now access to a great deal of data, and that which you can use to analyze what your audience wants, where you're reaching out to, and you can also conduct surveys and use technology to be clearer about what type of information is needed and how you can generate it to get where. And I think that we can see already in practice. We've seen, for example, Dawn.com has changed, so it generates a lot of information that its TV and newspaper doesn't, and it's for their online audiences only, a lot of which are outside audiences. So technology and AI is helping them become more audience conscious and more information conscious, and so they can exercise greater degree of, in relative terms, professionalism using that technology.
Right. Wonderful. Wonderful. So you also, I mean, like mentioned in your earlier talk that government or maybe the state as an important entity in all this landscape, or what we also in terms of communication call it the hierarchy. So there are other stakeholders as well in this hierarchy who are also influencing this entire news and storytelling business. So, for example, audiences also have a direct impact. I mean, it's not only media is impacting the audiences now because of the digital technology and all these new tools that are introduced, for example, social media, etc. So they are also influencing the content of the media. And likewise is the case of the market. I mean, like the advertisers, they are also, I mean, like we have seen in the case of conventional media in Pakistan that how advertisers are manipulating the message. So after this AI, what do you see, like what will be the state when advertiser will have a an influence on the storytelling and likewise the audiences. So how is this impact is going to be seen in the future?
So I think, again, in two ways. One is, what is media going to do about it, and what are audiences going to do about it? Increasing use of technology and AI in particular. And so I think we can see the larger media, not only the larger media houses positioning themselves by way of understanding better what the audiences want, but also understanding that there are the state still thinks that television has a greater nuisance value, and therefore there's bigger money involved there from public sector advertising that goes to these media houses. So they understand that, and so they've simply given up investigative journalism. And if you take a look at primetime news on television, um, it's just headlines. There's no news. So the most influential, I suppose, television private TV channel is Geo. You look at the 9 p.m., 9 to 10 p.m. news bulletin, and the first half hour is only headlines.
Yeah.
So one headline after another, because somewhere the government thinks, all right, as long as details are not given, then we're not going to target them. And the media has made out, okay, all right, we need to be wary about this, be aware about this. And we also know the audience isn't paying too much attention. So they just give them multiple headlines so that some of those headlines will keep them for that 1 hour.
Mm.
And so that becomes a vicious cycle when everybody starts doing it. So I think it affects the news agenda, because a headline is, not information. It's just an alert about information which has gone missing. You look at Pakistani vernacular print media, it's just headlines on front pages and back pages. Where's the information?
Mm.
And so TV has become like that. And so we find that media thinks this is a good formula, because it means this has become less labor intensive. They don't have to send teams out, and it becomes less cost intensive. So they don't have to pay too much money to do investigative stories or field reports and so on. Just do coverage of events, or just do, and that's why there are a lot of talk shows on Pakistani news channels rather than, a lot of news. So headlines and talking heads in a studio. On the other hand, audiences, and I think nowhere in the world, I think the youth follow news. They're not interested in news, and they're not interested in conventional formats of information or journalism like news bulletins. So they'll always go to social media, and they'll always go online, and they want information they want, rather than, be open to what is happening, and get it, and be exposed to that information, which means it's affecting news agendas, which means they're increasingly making light of information and the need to verify it. And it's just opinion. News is increasingly converting into opinion. And so they don't have to prove anything. They don't need two sources if they were breaking, if they're providing one particular set of information. And so this is like in many other places. What do the audiences want? And let's give them that. And because there's more of that, that's what audiences think they want. And so this whole and audiences are becoming media. They are becoming news sources themselves.
Yeah.
And this is relatively new. It's phenomenon not more than 10 to 12 years old. And we see, like in many other places, there's distrust in media. In fact, media is becoming irrelevant, and it's more infotainment than information. And AI is going to be and is being used to perpetuate this model, and that's what's happening in Pakistan also.
Right, right. And other than audiences, how do you see the role of advertisers in the news agenda, setting the news agenda?
Advertisers, certainly when it comes to big media, has always played a major role in determining news agendas. So you take Pakistan's, I don't know, 10 biggest advertisers by category. So telecom sector and beverages, food and beverages, your Pepsi and your KFCs and so on. And you take banking industry, and you cannot find any much content about these sectors in news. And that's because there's this understanding they're sort of 2/3 of all the advertising content coming from these large and the property sector. And so the DHA and the Behriyas and so on and so forth, and some other big players have also come in. And you will not find news about, a lot of how these big sectors are impacting consumers. You can only find online independent And at some point, I think we should mention there's also a separate ecosystem of independent, non-conventional media that is also emerging in Pakistan, as in many other places. We are usually, a few years late in catching up to trends, but it's happening in Pakistan now also, where public interest information, communities need information. And so I believe in this news you can use concept. The only way journalism is going to survive if you provide news that consumers can use to either improve understanding of something, or they can use it to access some service or other follow-up information they can use for themselves. Not just, he said that or she said whatever, she has done whatever. And so these independent content producers, and I don't mean the YouTubers, they're not, they're just opinionists.
Yeah.
And they can vary from the bad to really crazy. And so that's not who I mean. I mean, some, as far
Behavioral
as their
alternate media
limit,
that is emerging.
yes, like Sujag, or which is, more community oriented and more Punjab, and they focus on the intermediate, semi-rural area, semi-urban, semi-rural communities, agriculture in Punjab, the agriculture sector, and they generate a lot of information related to that. And then, for opinion, we have, Hamsab, where anybody can write for them, and all those opinions that you can't find on, you only find Hassan Nisar on primetime Geo, and Irshad Bhatti there. And who wants to listen to them apart from, certain types? And so there are other people who want, this what about me, information about me, and I have something to say. And so people who want to speak um, about issues that aren't on conventional media, then these little interesting small information operations, community information, um, is also emerging, and the advertising sector is also starting to pay attention, because on their own, while they cannot really compete with the corporate media, but they are finding these. Pakistan is a big country, even small communities, several hundreds of thousands of consumers. They're pretty regular in their in visiting and consuming this information and contributing as also uh, citizen journalists, let's say. And so, that little ecosystem is also influencing
Right.
um,
Right.
use of technology and AI.
Right.
And it's helping these independent information operations become slightly more sustainable than they were, let's say, 10 years ago.
Right, right, wonderful. So I think this is a very right time to ask this question, because you have already mentioned about all these alternate spaces like small digital media that is being practiced in different parts of the country, not as YouTubers or like individual journalists, or not in a real professional way, but there are definitely groups, individual or small level groups, like you mentioned about Sujag or Native Media or TCM is there, so they are emerging.
Hmm.
So, but how do you see after this AI is there in their hands? So, is this space going to expand, and is the news agenda going to be more liberal than today, as we see in the conventional media case?
That's a really interesting question. So number one, I think, oh yes, news agenda is going to expand, because if we look at not just our state, but our deep state, where it has just experimented with a political party, and used what they themselves call the fifth information generation,
Wow.
and so they were basically engaging these floating youth in providing of them, of course, not information, but propaganda. And that's because the deep state thinks it's really important to influence them because, let's say from since the last martial law ended in 2007 and elections were held in 2008, um, between then and now, over 20 million new voters have been added. And so because our news is overtly political, then, political narratives need to be influenced. And of course, the deep state has it asserts its claim on, a large part of that demographic. And so they've been using digital media and digital spaces and online spaces to engage with that demographic. The conventional media was slow in understanding this demographic as a potential audience. Now they do, clearly because we've just had a the fifth generation war where propaganda has turned into something much more vicious, into hate speech. Propaganda can be, positive also. Affirmation is all about positive discrimination, but but propaganda on the wrong side can become hate speech, which is what it has become. And now I think number one, Pakistani population is interested in information. So they're not information shy or information phobic. Everybody has an opinion because not everybody gets to hear their opinion on conventional media. The online spaces have provided them this ability to do so. And in fact, you look at how this small ecosystem of YouTubers, where all those journalists that the deep state kicked out of conventional media for what now looks like really mild, when they were working for conventional media, what the deep state back then thought was a harsh speech was nothing compared to what they can do now online through YouTube. And they can't shut down YouTube. They have to shut the entire YouTube to shut them down. And so I think, yes, more and more people are using and will continue to use these technologies and AI to reach out to even more public. And number two, this disintegration of the broader media landscape in terms of audiences means that audiences are becoming, as we expected, a few years ago, just special bubbles, people interested for a particular time in a particular subject. And so quickly, we find a lot of small operations that are catering to them, in some cases also generating those interest themes. And there's a lot of noise around those themes, and then they move on to the next thing. Like elections are coming in now, and elections will become a big thing, and then suddenly we've just had several weeks of 9th May and what happened after that, and nothing else was being talked about online, whereas mainstream media can't even say the I word now, Imran. And they even blotted out Imran's picture on mainstream channels when he was meeting with the IMF delegation. But this will change, and that's because there is a limit to how much there's a limit to state's ability to keep people away from information they don't want them to be consuming. That is not possible anymore now. They have to become North Korea or Iran to be able to do that. But we've seen that even in that sense, it doesn't help much. And so a middle ground will happen. Of course, we're in the election season now, and after the elections have happened, a few months after elections, things will become normal. The information agendas will not be too polarizing. And then, people will want to know about local issues, and mm, so a more normal news agenda will emerge. And that means more boring news and information, which for economists is great because it means development, but um, for media, probably conventional media, it's bad news because it doesn't translate into quick, large audiences. And then they have to do investigative reporting. And Pakistan is a large country. And, if Punjab were an independent country, it would be the 14th or 13th largest country in the world. And in that one province alone, that's a huge. Pakistan is one of the top 10 largest digital markets. And so AI is going to be increasingly used. We shouldn't worry too much about news agendas because they will shift. We After these, some judges go away, and the new government comes in, and the new chief settles in, and then the news agendas will change. These are cycled agendas, and they will end.
Right, right. Let's shift the gear towards digital journalism right now. What's the state of digital journalism being practiced in Pakistan? Is there a space for this type of storytelling in Pakistan or not, or where the capacities or competencies gaps exist and how they can be bridged? So I mean, like I have just clubbed all these questions in one, so that like
Sure.
it's your job easier.
Well, I think first of all, we know both the present and future of Pakistani journalism, like in all other places, is digital, right? And so new, people aren't. It's just people like me who, out of habit, are still buying newspapers and reading them, but people are not. It's just not practical anymore because you don't read full newspapers. And so you want information you want. Likewise, people are sick and tired of talk shows and these headline news bulletins. Headline bulletin, not news bulletins. And so, a lot of this will shift. And we've seen many newsrooms now currently struggling. And we've seen that the small, let's say a few dozen journalists that brought a lot of money to these television channels are now prevented from being on those channels. And it's funny in one sense. But and that's an indicator of how their time has come and gone, how that one particular need has come and gone. So it's going to be digital, most of it. Secondly, I think we're as as an overtly centralized country, we also view the media landscape in a centralized way. So if the media's future is digital, and so one next logical question is, are Pakistani political pluralism, ethnic, linguist, political, economic, going to be reflected in this changing, shifting, evolving, morphing digital media landscape? Then I think the answer to that is it's already happening. Not only will it happen, it's already happening. So, for example, I currently work with an alliance called the Digital Media Alliance of Pakistan, DigiMap. And so we tried to map, what was happening in terms of digital journalism practice 3 years ago. Who are the new players? So we said no legacy players. So we will not map TV channels or newspapers that are licensed by the state. So independent ones and those who are not doing entertainment but information and have a local audience. And so they've gone from a membership of 14 3 years ago to 40 now. Um, and it's staggering. And so there's also a separate group of, and so they do really interesting things, from opinion to analysis to news to user generated content to self generated original content. And they do all kinds of media, from video, audio, text, multimedia, public interest journalism to public action journalism, and so on. And there's a and so the most difficult thing to practice, a litmus test, let's say, for so we were trying to see how diverse and plural this media is. So a litmus test would be, what is the most difficult subject in Pakistan to write or report about? And there are many things. Of course, there's writing about the deep state, but then, that's such a, uh, it, it takes away from more public interest view of things. So it has got to be, let's say, writing about religious minorities, because in terms of audiences, they're small. So who's going to write about them? And who's certainly going to write about the problems they have? Who wants to read about them? Um, and so we've been mapping, and we found over 30 religious minority owned independent digital media platforms alone. So an ecosystem within an ecosystem. And so we find there are all these journalists doing all these interesting things. Of course, there are, they all face various problems, from resource problems to professionalism problems. But we can clearly see they're focusing on, for example, specific local, hyperlocal communities. For example, they're talking to women, they're talking to, rural communities, they're talking to ordinary people, and they have all these interesting audiences. These small, ranging from several thousand to hundreds of thousands, and some have, run into millions. And so this means the need for public interest information will remain there.
Hmm.
And everything that the state and the deep state, so the state is, the judiciary doesn't want you to talk about their accountability, the military doesn't want to talk to about their accountability, the bureaucracy doesn't want to talk to about their accountability. And so what about political forces? What about social forces? And what about these human rights movements? What about, for example, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement? What about the Aurat March, the women's rights movement, and the digital rights movement? All information about them and communities about them is not, you will not find them in newspapers. You will not find them on TV. This kind of, the state has failed to prevent audiences and these platforms from running this parallel media online. So it means that the state cannot stop this, and people will find alternative spaces, alternative digital communities. They will use AI to dodge the government. They will use the AI to frustrate the state, and they will use AI to talk about their interests. And the platforms that are managing these small operations will talk about these audiences that the state pretends don't exist, and the media cannot do anything because they're corporate media, because they're compromised. And so eventually everybody will have to come to what people want, what consumers want, because consumers of information are consumers of consumables. And so you will have to listen to them. If you are conventional media or corporate media, even the advertisers will be forced to support operations that involve communities, information operations. We want to call them, formal news operations or not. That is a separate matter. But it's about, people and the information they need, and operations and platforms that provide the information they need. Or if they can't provide it themselves, then they become conduits, or they help become consumers, become media.
Right, right. I think,
Media
yeah,
is all about mediating interest and information in the form of information.
right, right.
And that's happening in Pakistan.
Great, great. I think you have wonderfully explained all this digital media landscape as well. And just a last question: do you see any space for digital journalism, like I mean, so not digital journalism, like the data-driven stories in this entire evolving landscape of digital media in Pakistan? And what are the existing competencies of Pakistani journalists? Are they enough to respond to or meet the requirement of digital data journalism storytelling or not?
So I think the news you can use form of journalism um, has to include data and extrapolation of data. The public, don't understand easily on an everyday basis figures. But all public, if media is to be public interest journalism, then they have to look at data. And the government cannot hide data anymore. But the challenge becomes a professional one in how to use data and translate that into public interest information or public interest journalism. And that both independent small scale news operations and the conventional corporate media both face, it's not just merely an issue of resources, it's an issue of priority and technical skills that their journalists must have. So it is but inevitable that they will come to that. But I think um, I think the conventional media will take a lead there, and to start addressing some of these issues. But it will remain a challenge until we have a critical mass where you do stories that um, that link issues to people's interest. Until then, just budgetary figures will not matter. For example, this popular perception that people just take a look at the federal budget and say this percent of budget was for defense and this was for debt servicing, but only, let's say, 24 billion rupees was set aside for education. It is a fallacy because the federal education budget is just for the federal education infrastructure. The provinces have their separate budgets, and the country has over ₹1 trillion. So what the media needs to do is see how much of that goes into non bricks and mortar infrastructure in Punjab, let's say, or in Gujranwala district, if that's where the largest number of students are. And data journalism provides this wonderful opportunity to convert that into a public interest issue that the government has to respond to. Um, so I think it's inevitable that we will go there, but until there are enough support groups available that will create, I don't know, let's say at least 500 journalists who are really good who understand data journalism. We need, wherever they may be, whether in state-owned media or private sector media, we need a critical mass of data journalism journalists for it to become then mandatory or necessary for the rest of the media to then also follow suit. A few good journalists are not enough.
Right.
You're free to quote me on everything I've spoken about. You can be public about it. There's nothing here.
Yeah.
And I don't believe in, I keep talking about, fighting censorship and especially, self-censorship. The last thing I will do is, practice it myself. But I think there are another couple of points I would like to make.
Sure, sure.
But very briefly. So one is, I think, so what is AI? It's essentially how intelligence uses already available information. What does ChatGPT do? It dives into all information available on the internet or anywhere that it can access and use it. I mean, we humans can't use it as quickly as it can. And that's why, so the question is, who's developing this AI? And is the South, countries like ours, involved um, in shaping how AI uses that information? So will it end up using, let's say, overwhelmingly just north-based information in whatever answers or analysis it generates? And I think our media, Pakistan, India, South Asia, China, we need to be also talking about how that landscape is being shaped, because it will affect us if if chat gpt becomes the electronic version of the white man and gives whatever opinions And they have issues about
the algorithmic biases that you are now
algorithmic biases that they already have against blacks and Hispanics and in many ways about dispossessed social groups. But I think our media should be supported and invested in also understanding the influence of AI on media. It's not just you who should be writing, examining this and doing a paper, but there should be a team, a large team of journalists who should understand this better and report on this, not just in Pakistan, but wherever. And the second, I think, is so AI is essentially free labor for newsrooms. So media entities are going to use AI to generate information in conventional forms using as few people or journalists as necessary. And so media sector or industry will remain just as exploitative if it uses if it depends more on AI than on human journalists. And so we need to find ways where our journalists become human journalists, become more professional, and are also adequately compensated in terms of uh, the capacities that they will then emerge with and be able to use that. Using AI should become a proper skill set to ensure that journalism principles are met, and accordingly they should be compensated in those terms. And so I think that's a conversation the media should be having. And so we don't really want the ISPR turning into one giant robot that will only send. So anything about the security domain will be sent by them, and the media will just simply use that information. Where we know that used to happen when I was starting out in journalism in the in the late 1980s. I know the ISPR equivalent back then when I used to work at a news agency, they just used to send type notes news, to be used with imagined quotes and imagined news sources. And now, of course, they do much more than that. They create bots and these supposedly independent bots, and they just use a lot of university students to do their stuff. And so we need, our media, one of the first things they should do about AI is understanding that AI is here to help the human part of journalism, not the other way around. Humans are not there to help AI. AI is there to help them. And so we need to come up with conversations that inform agendas of how AI will be welcomed, should be welcomed in newsrooms, not as a dictator of how journalism should be done, but as a facilitator of public interest agendas and what are the rules by which all of that should happen.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. One last question from this last insight that you shared. There is also a discussion globally that AI is also going to threaten the jobs of journalists. So how do you see in Pakistan? Do you also do you buy this argument in the context of Pakistan, or do you really feel like there will be more jobs when AI will be in journalism?
So AI, the best use of AI in journalism will be, of course, to speed up workflow processes, make them more efficient. But which AI is going to verify information from human sources, actual people on the ground? Will AI talk to people on the ground? So we will need humans to talk to humans. AI can come up with good, access to maybe online information sources that the human journalist won't have immediately. But um, talking to people will always be done by humans. And so it's important that journalism remains, doesn't become, I don't know, these, sort of like in our Pakistani education context, we have these guidebooks to help you prepare for exams. So we don't want this guidebook journalism. We want to use AI in doing human journalism, looking at applying the human angle to it. So of course, a lot of so when the digital when the online sphere came, then a lot of digital publication meant that we didn't need printing presses if people were going to read newspapers on their phones. So technology can help there, and there's no need to fight about that. But we should fight about job replacements will always be there, not just in journalism, by AI and by technology. It will always happen because that's what technology is, an extension of humans. But where the story, journalism is the story of humanity, and that story will be written and should be told by humans, not by AIs. That role will not go to robots. They can provide us information, quickly process information, but the editor's job will not go to an AI. We will need editors to make decisions on whether the story is adequately human interest oriented or not. And so, yes, we shouldn't worry too much about that. Some jobs will be lost, but new ones, because journalism will change. The way journalism is then conducted, produced, and facilitated will also change. And any technology that can help us make journalism fit for those changing times should be welcomed. But all of this should be an informed process. It should be dialogue driven and conversation driven, and media stakeholders should be talking about these, and human rights sector should be talking with the media because they help each other. And so those how will the public interest agendas can be ensured? That should be sort of the driving centrality of this conversation.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think this is a very good note to conclude our discussion, and I really enjoyed talking to you. I mean, it's not only this time, but always like from the time when I jumped into journalism profession, like in 2006. So like, I've been into this conversation with you and other people. So it's always wonderful talking to you and Khatak Saab and other people in this field. So thank you very much for sparing so much time on this important discussion and this topic. And hopefully this is going to help the overall media stakeholders who are involved in the media landscape. Once again, thank you very much, Adnan Sir.
Thank you, Harun, and all the best.